at me.
Kia ora koutou. Good morning and welcome everybody. Look, Fork in the Road is the theme of this Building Nations. Following the recent climate change conference in Glasgow, many of you might wonder if humanity's actually taken the wrong fork. So it's very timely to be discussing the role of renewable energy in decarbonising New Zealand just now. So I'm delighted to introduce to you from Westpac Bank, Andrew Kittle, Director Loan, Product, Corporate and Structured Finance. Andrew's been at Westpac for 11 years. He's responsible for the origination and execution of structured lending for project and acquisition finance. Whilst at Westpac, Andrew's been part of a number of high-profile project and acquisition finance transactions, including Junction Road Peaker Plant, acquisition of First Fibre, acquisition of First Gas, and several PPPs. Prior to joining Westpac, Andrew worked in corporate finance roles at Vector Limited and Genesis Power Limited. I'm really looking forward to this session. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Grant, for your very kind introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on renewable energy and decarbonisation. As you know, climate change is probably the biggest risk facing us all right now. Westpac's proud to be doing our part to move New Zealand towards a lower carbon future. Sustainability is a core part of our DNA and has been for quite some time. We've consistently been named amongst the most sustainable banks in the world by Dow Jones and have actually achieved top spot in 2017. Our sustainability strategy has some very strong targets to support the transition to net zero emissions economy. By 2020, we aim to reduce our operational emissions by 30% and enable $10 billion in sustainable finance. Westpac was the first bank in New Zealand to form a sustainable finance team. Our sustainable finance team, led by Joanna Silva, has assisted numerous companies, including Genesis Energy and Contact Energy, with their sustainability frameworks and implementing their first sustainability-linked loans. Sustainability-linked loans provide financial incentives to meet agreed. Genesis targets, for instance, include reductions across all scopes of emissions, ramping up their program of renewable energy generation, and a future of work program. Lastly, Westpac is proud to be assisting both Lodestone Energy and Hiringa Energy with the financing of their green energy projects. You'll hear more about these projects later on when we get to the panel. So in terms of the decarbonisation task, the choice to walk on the road, carry on the way we are and face the inevitable long-term consequences of global warming, or reduce carbon for a better future. Currently, according to the World Economic Forum, around 80% of the world's energy is supplied by fossil fuels. So there has to be a massive increase in renewable energy in order to decarbonise and meet climate change targets. The International Energy Agency estimates that to stay on the path to maintaining 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, the total annual global investment in clean power and related infrastructure needs to rise from US $380 billion to $1.6 trillion by 2030. The graph on the screen is from Climate Action Tracker Group, an independent research group. It shows the path of carbon emissions with current policies, which will only take us to 2.5 degrees, against current pledges and what we need to do to get to net zero targets. You can see that there's quite an ambitious gap already. This graph was updated during COP26, but it was before the controversial positions adopted by China and India related to coal-fired generation. So the task ahead is probably even tougher now. And it's worthwhile noting that for every year we don't make the targets, the task gets tougher. Turning to New Zealand. This graph shows the greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand from 1990 to 2019. Total emissions have grown 44% over the past 30 years. The main driver of this, no pun intended, is actually being transport. Transport emissions have increased 84% over the past 30 years, or at an annual rate of 2.1%. Energy industries like electricity generation have reduced emissions over this time due to less coal and gas-fired generation. So whilst emissions from electricity have fallen over time, and they will keep falling, electricity has a very big part to play in New Zealand's decarbonisation future. Renewable energy can enable decarbonisation through powering things like EVs and public transport, powering the production of renewable fuels like hydrogen and in industrial processes like replacing coal-fired boilers with electric boilers. Renewable energy has seen significant growth globally. Over the past 7 years, growth in renewable energy has outstripped non-renewable energy. Solar has been the biggest driver of this, followed by wind. So to put this graph into perspective, last year there was over 125,000 megawatts of new solar generation installed. That's 12 times the amount of generation in New Zealand. In terms of wind generation, there was over 104,000 megawatts of new generation last year, which was about 10 times the amount of generation in New Zealand. Growth has been primarily coming out of Asia, particularly solar in China. There have been some very interesting and innovative projects happening globally. For example, this project in Singapore caught my eye. It's a floating 60 megawatt solar farm spanning 45 hectares, which is equivalent to about 45 football fields. The electricity generated by the solar farm will power Singapore's 5 local water treatment plants. It'll reduce carbon emissions by 32 kilotons annually, which is about taking 7,000 cars off the road. Part of this reason for this massive growth has been the decline in the levelized cost of energy. The levelized cost of energy is the effective economic break-even point for new generation. Back in 2009, for example, the cost of solar, the break-even cost for solar ranged from US $101 per megawatt hour to $169 per megawatt hour. For solar, it was much higher. It was $323 per megawatt hour to $394. By 2021, that's dropped to $30 to $41. These falls have been driven by technological improvements, reduction in manufacturing costs, and by increased demand. Turning to New Zealand. As everyone undoubtedly knows, New Zealand has a very high proportion of renewable generation. It's mainly hydro at approximately 70%, followed by geothermal at 22% and wind at 6%. Solar is just starting out. Currently, there are no utility-scale solar plants in New Zealand. The biggest issue, however, is our renewable generation being predominantly hydro, is that our hydro lakes do not have a lot of storage. The lakes only have sufficient storage to cover around 8 to 12 weeks of generation without additional inflows. So as such, New Zealand is more vulnerable to dry year risk when there is not enough water to generate. Currently, we use thermal generation to cover dry year risk. Of course, dry year risk can be met by building new wind and solar generation. However, to state the obvious, wind and solar are both dependent on when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. So as such, they may not be available to generate when required. To rely on renewable generation to cover dry year risk, we would need to build more generation than required, which is obviously very expensive. The reality is, we will need a variety of ways to solve this problem. Things like demand response from customers like load interruption and large-scale batteries. In terms of batteries, I know both Meridian and Well networks are currently investigating battery projects. There has also been a battery project completed in South Australia recently. This is the 150 megawatt Hornsdale power plant, which utilises Tesla batteries and is connected to a wind farm. In terms of wind generation, Transpower estimates that to help meet our carbon reduction targets, wind generation will need to grow by an extra 4,000 megawatts over the next 20 years. To put this into context, there is currently 820 megawatts of wind generation operating in New Zealand, and that has taken 20 years to develop, so the task ahead is also very challenging. There has been some excellent recent progress. Tilt has commissioned the Waipipi wind farm at 133 megawatts. Mercury is currently constructing Turitea, which will be the largest in New Zealand, at 222 megawatts. Meridian has started constructing Harapaki, which will be 176 megawatts. Main Power is getting ready to construct Mount Cass at 93 megawatts. Contact has teamed up with Roaring Forties to plan a pipeline of development. And Genesis Energy is partnering with firms like Tilt Energy to commit to long-term offtake agreements. There are some favourable factors supporting the future growth of wind generation in New Zealand. As I previously noted, the cost of wind generation has been declining. Turbines are getting bigger and more efficient. Older turbines used to be around 2 megawatts capacity of each, but now they can be 4 to 5. Technology continues to move fast. The Vestas turbines being installed by Hiringa Energy are 6 megawatts. New Zealand also has excellent wind resources. Our wind farms have long-run average capacity factors of around 40%. Think of capacity factors as being the relative efficiency. So for every 1 megawatt hour of possible generation, a 40% capacity factor would yield 400 kilowatts of actual generation. This is high by international standards. In comparison, it has been reported that capacity factors in Europe can be around 25%. All of these mean that the levelized cost of energy is likely to decline a bit further and making it more economic to develop new wind farms. Solar generation. So solar is unique because of its potential for continued cost reductions, its modularity, ease and speed of installation. It's suitable for a wide range of applications and sites such as integration into new or existing buildings. Solar therefore has the potential to provide reliable and low emissions electricity for the future. New Zealand is just starting down the path of utility scale solar. Genesis has recently announced a JV with FRV, and you'll hear more about that later. Lodestone is getting ready to construct 5 solar farms, and Far North Solar has commenced work on a 16 megawatt solar farm near Cape Hiringa. Whilst New Zealand does not have the same level of resources, solar resources, compared to the likes of Australia, a recent report by Alan Miller Consulting shows that New Zealand does have a large number of areas where solar generation is likely to be feasible. These areas are spread right across the country and not to the top of the North Island. They include areas like South Canterbury, Tasman, Hawke's Bay, and Central Otago. Generally, the economics of utility scale solar are harder in New Zealand due to these capital costs and the lower capacity factors that they face, usually around about 20%. However, economics are improving as capital costs continue to come down and technology continues to improve. Things like dual-axis trackers to follow the path of the sun and bifacial used by Lodestone Energy to improve efficiency, and the ones that you see on screen, and also improved inverter loadings. Batteries will also be combined with solar eventually, and those will greatly assist the economics of solar generation. Turning to hydrogen. Hydrogen is a clean burning gas which only emits water at the point of combustion. The emissions challenge is related to production. Most hydrogen production globally is produced by burning fossil fuels. There is a growing transition to green hydrogen. Wind and solar power are both natural partners to hydrogen due to their declining capital costs, low operating costs, and scalability. Both onshore and offshore wind is being utilised, and there are projects being undertaken all over the world. So on screen is a sample of some of the projects that are happening globally. There are projects in Western Australia, the Netherlands, Germany, China, Saudi Arabia, Denmark, and Norway. Closer to home, there's the Hiringa Energy project. Hiringa has formed a JV with Balance and secured investment from Mitsui to produce hydrogen from wind power. Other work being undertaken in New Zealand includes the Ports of Auckland commissioning a hydrogen demonstration project, and Contact and Meridian forming a JV to investigate the potential for large-scale hydrogen production in Southland. Hydrogen has the potential to play a significant role in reducing New Zealand's carbon emissions. It can be stored and used to generate electricity to cover dry year risk. It can be used in hard-to-abate industries such as heavy transport, shipping, and some industrial processes. Hydrogen is quite possibly the only decarbonisation solution for some countries like Japan who have scarce renewable energy resources. As such, the global demand forecasts for green hydrogen are high, and the future is bright for hydrogen projects. So now to the interesting part, the people you actually want to hear from today. We have a great mix of panelists for you. They are all very experienced in the sector, and they'll provide their unique insights into renewable energy and decarbonisation. We have 2 of New Zealand's renewable energy entrepreneurs who are paving the way with their innovative thinking. We have Gary Holden, CEO and founder of Lodestone Energy. We have Cathy, Clennett, Executive Director and founder of Hiringa Energy. We have Nigel Clark, Chief Operations Officer at Genesis Energy. Nigel leads Genesis's renewables energy strategy. And we have Blair Walter, Blair is the renewable sector lead at Aurecon. He's one of New Zealand's leading renewable energy engineers and has worked across multiple projects across New Zealand and Australia. So this will be a very interesting panel indeed. Welcome, everybody. Sorry, we have one slight technical problem at the moment. Unfortunately, Blair hasn't been able to join us. Okay, welcome panelists. I think maybe just as a starting point, maybe we could start by Cathy telling us a little bit about her about Hiringa Energy, and then maybe to Gary, and Gary can tell us about his project.
Great, thanks, Andrew. As Andrew said, I'm Cathy Clennett. I'm a co-founder at Hiringa Energy. We're a hydrogen energy company, so we work right through the value chain, and a big part of what we do is actually linking the generation of electricity, production of hydrogen to the end market. And one of the key end markets that we address is heavy transport. So some of you may have seen our announcements recently that we're starting the construction of New Zealand's first hydrogen refueling network. So we have 4 stations in the North Island to start, and then a plan to expand to over 20 stations over the next 5 years.
Oh, that's quite some growth. It's fantastic to hear. Gary, how about tell us about Lodestone and your plans?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, as you mentioned, we are building 5 sites as a starting point. We've been thinking about these 5 locations really as one big solar project located in 5 sunny spots in the northern part of the country, and we expect to have those built over the next 24 to 30 months. And you know, New Zealand does have the conditions for solar on an independent basis, and so we're a new entrant to the market, but we intend to sell our power through retail channels to consumers. And you know, New Zealand is kind of world famous, I think, for the effort that's gone into building an advanced smart metering network and the ability to sell energy peer-to-peer between generation sites and customers' demand points. And so we're building a business on that idea. It's sort of what was intended when we put the market together 25 years ago, and here we are now with solar fundamentally economic and able to be built at scale. You know, launching you know, a big move and helping New Zealand get to its target of 100% renewable energy by 2030.
Okay, yeah. And Nigel, how about tell us a bit more about Genesis's JV you're forming with FRV. Tell us a bit about FRV and what your plans are.
Yeah, so look, FRV Australia is a significant solar developer in the Australian market. They developed over 800 megawatts to date already of solar. They're owned by 2 significant international infrastructure developers, and particularly of renewable energy, in ALJ and recently OMERS coming in as their other significant shareholders. So we believe bringing their skill set together with our skill set that's on the ground in New Zealand is going to be a powerful combination as we target to build 500 megawatts, which is equivalent to 750 gigawatts hours of energy in the next 5 years. And so we've recently gone through a tactical process to select the preferred partner, which is FRV, and we're really excited about what's going to start to unfold next year, and it'll predominantly be likely targeting North Island as well, similar to Lodestone. And but we're really seeing a coming together of skill sets of two entities into that joint venture. So
that's the future is bright, isn't it? There's a lot of things happening in this sector. What sort of challenges have you all faced in terms of getting to where you've gotten to? Maybe we could start with Gary. What sort of challenges Lodestone off the ground?
Well, the solar industry globally has gone through 10 years of rapid change from a very high cost technology to probably the lowest cost technology now. And during that transition, everyone spent the time learning how to finance these projects. And most of the financing of these projects is on the back of, long-term contracts or feed-in tariffs or, a government-backed purchase arrangement through an RFP. And so the challenge in New Zealand, because it's actually a fully free market where, buyers and sellers try to find themselves, and getting the risk management organized through the market mechanisms is kind of a new thing in the industry. And I would say our biggest challenge is just getting the understanding up that building solar into a market with hedging programs and traditional risk management tools, and using the connections between generators and customers to build the risk matrix up so that these projects can be financed is first of all it's always been intended to be done this way in this market, but it's always difficult to be kind of the first mover to put that together, and that's probably been our most difficult thing to arrange. But thankfully we've got people that really understand the market behind us, and Westpac has been great to kind of help us through how those risk management tools can be put to use. And it's we're on our way. It's a $300 million program, but really it's built on the back of the risk management mechanisms that are in the market itself.
Okay. Oh, thank you. That's great. How about you, Cathy? What sort of, have you faced similar challenges? Was financing a key challenge towards yours, or was it more sort of because very first hydrogen project off the ground in New Zealand at any scale? What sort of it would have been very difficult indeed to get it going.
Yeah, I think some of the earlier challenges that we faced as a company were really overcoming inertia to change and perception. So I guess for 30 odd years, we've been hearing about reducing our emissions. We've also been hearing about the promise of hydrogen, the reduction in cost and increasing the efficiency of fuel cells and the technology. But I think there's been little action, and this probably applies across all different renewable technologies, not just to hydrogen, but the alternatives have struggled to compete on performance and price, and it's not a perfect market. So the externalities of climate haven't been priced into our existing system, and there is an inertia built into our economy and into our installed infrastructure. So especially in the key market that we're looking to address, which is liquid fuels for transport. So there's been a lot of barriers in that way. There's also been breaking that chicken and egg problem of hydrogen and creating a clear pathway for green hydrogen to be competitive with fossil fuels. And then that's all about creating the end demand that makes a project investable and fundable. So without that demand and a clear line of sight to that demand, it's very hard for anyone to invest in hydrogen production, to invest in refueling infrastructure, for example. So a big part of the work that we've had to do is work right through that value chain and bring together the end market and the production and match them. So we've partnered right from generation with our project with Balance Agri-Nutrients through to our refueling network with partners such as Waitomo, into the end market with partners like TR Group and TIL, who are the transport operators.
So you're extending right across the value chain, Yeah,
and the trick of that, I guess, is having solid commercial arrangements right through that value chain that tie it all together, and then being able to present that in a cohesive way to investors. And so thankfully we're over that hurdle now, which is great.
And the contracts underpin the value and create the financeability of the project. Exactly. When you say the climate hasn't been priced in, are you saying that you don't think the carbon price has reached quite the level it needs to be yet? Is that what?
Definitely not, and not for transport. So when we're looking at sort of a direct replacement. And actually, to be fair, even industrial applications are still really challenging. So there needs to be some movement there. And I think it probably needs to be application specific. So a single carbon price is quite a blunt tool to use if you're trying to stimulate the adoption of renewables, and so I think, or renewable liquid fuels in particular.
So do you think there needs to be, how would you see it? Does there need to be several types of, several different carbon prices, several different type of carbon instruments?
I think the carbon trading and carbon pricing is really important. So I definitely think we need that, but I also think that there needs to be more targeted measures. So, for example, with the transport sector and adoption of fuel cell vehicles, there's still quite a delta in capital cost on those vehicles. So there's a role right now to get volume up and get costs down. So I guess similar to, what we've seen in other industries, similar to rebates that we saw for solar initially when the cost was higher. Even if you look at exploration for oil and gas, there are tax incentives for that. So in a way, you could argue that the government is providing incentives in that area as well. So, but at the moment, there's nothing in hydrogen. So there's no mechanisms to support it. So we're not even on an even playing field, to be fair.
So I guess sort of the theme coming through is that to decarbonise, it's not just electricity, it's a portfolio approach right across the energy sector. And so what sort of barriers are we seeing? Maybe starting with Gary.
To decarbonize the entire
barriers
market,
to decarbonisation, across the sector.
I think the main thing from my perspective is the electrification of passenger cars is obviously a big piece of this, and we see the one great thing about renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar, even if you include batteries in the mix, it's extremely inexpensive to put into an electric car compared to gasoline. And so, roughly speaking, the marginal cost from one of our solar farms would produce fuel at about an equivalent of 20 cents a liter. And so if you can build solar farms infinitely, you could potentially be dramatically reducing the cost of transportation. And so I know there's lots of dynamics around pricing carbon, and there's lots of conversation about what do we do about the high cost of renewable energy. But when it's used and applied in transportation, it's actually a very cheap source of energy for the globe. And so I think the barriers are mostly just getting onto it and finding the market mechanisms, using them well. New Zealand is land constrained, and so I think ultimately we're going to find we're limited in how much solar we can do. We're limited in how much land-based wind we can do. So I'm in the camp of ultimately for New Zealand, we'll probably be building very large wind farms offshore and probably using a great deal of that energy to make hydrogen. And so if I go out 20 years from now, New Zealand has quite a fleet of offshore wind farms. And when that becomes part of the plan, becoming 100% renewable energy is pretty straightforward process. And so that's what I would see as the future.
Okay, so I'll just pick up on that point, just explore that point a little bit further about offshore wind. Offshore wind overseas is really being dominated by highly subsidised wind farms from government renewable energy certificates of the like, and there is also quite a support network at the cable laying, specialist maintenance ships. Given that New Zealand's sort of at the we're at the bottom of the world, it'll be quite hard I would have thought to establish that network. What would be your views on that? Do you think it will come?
Oh, I definitely do. I mean, everything's hard in the beginning, and you often need government support in the beginning. You know, the latest projects in Scotland are coming in around $80 a megawatt hour US. So the you know, the cost threshold is coming into focus. You know, to the point about carbon pricing, all it takes is a little bit more movement in carbon pricing to bring those numbers into the frame. You know, building floating technologies is probably where we'll go. You could imagine a shore-based facility building a floating wind turbine almost on a continuous basis for the next 20 years, and dragging them out into the ocean and putting them into service. So I know it's a daunting and it's big and it's intimidating, but so is building offshore gas and offshore oil. And so we're building, you know, you go back a long time, it seemed pretty impossible to build railways in this country. So I don't think anything should be considered off limits. If we really are committed to being 100% renewable, then we've got to imagine all of the things available in the world being available in New Zealand.
Okay. And generally, you know, my view is, you know, the renewables target is quite ambitious because, I mean, of what I mentioned earlier, that to solve our dry year risk, we would need to be overbuilding. And having renewables energy that are intermittent generation creates things like there's stress on the grid caused by this intermittent generation. I mean, this problem is faced in Australia. So I guess, you know, I'll turn to Nigel. I mean, can we achieve 100% renewable? How do we do it? And, you know, given the cost, you know, of achieving the last mile is probably quite cost prohibitive. Do we actually even want to get there and still retain some kind of thermal generation?
I think it's a key question. I mean, we would advocate more of a system approach as to where your main carbon emissions are in New Zealand. As you articulated earlier, it's largely industrial, agricultural, and transport. So rather than picking a winner and a silo thinking of 100% renewable electricity generation, we would rather argue a system approach, because we think electricity in itself is going to be one of the enablers to decarbonise. So do you need to chase that last 1 to 2%? We probably don't believe so, and certainly in the foreseeable future, your ability to back up the system is going to be crucial, and that's the role that the thermal plays. That in time become less, absolutely cut. Genesis is actively displacing our baseload thermal generation. We've targeted 2,650 gigawatts to reduce, and we're almost at 2,000 now with our commitments, with the two wind farms that we've signed up to, plus the Tahara geothermal, and then plus our solar commitments. So coal and gas will play less of a role, but that backup aspect is crucial. And dry year you can't avoid in New Zealand, but also interseasonal plays as well. Between winter and summer are fairly large. So chasing that last 1 or 2%, one has to ask, is it really worthwhile versus the total system approach of decarbonising?
Yeah, and still retaining some form of thermal. Sorry, Cathy, go.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that, Gary. I think, you know, 100% electricity, it's good to have renewable electricity is, you know, it's good to have goals like this, but actually our electricity system is only part of our energy system. You know, like over 60% of our energy needs are still met by fossil fuels. So electricity is part of that story and needs to grow, but there are probably other areas that we could be spending that money and time and effort and have a much greater impact on decarbonisation of our whole energy system.
Okay. I think the other thing is reliability too. You only have to look at August 9 events this year. We are a modern advanced society, and consumers have no tolerance for electricity not being reliable 24/7, 100%. So to think that we could jeopardize our future system by not having sufficient backup is a really, you know, dangerous question. And as I said, consumer sentiment and needs of industry is certainly not to have an unreliable and insecure power system.
Yeah, and that's the problem with some renewables, that they are intermittent generation, and, you know, if the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, then, you know, we do have to have something to support it. And so, yeah, gas does have a role to play going forward.
I think also it's a matter of like there needs to be a storage, whatever that is, like storage, and also sort of more investment in our electrical infrastructure, as well as the demand management. So on our side, we see hydrogen can actually play a role in a number of those areas. So you can have an instantaneous demand control from your production with hydrogen, plus it's actually a store in itself. So you're helping to alleviate some of those problems. And probably the other really interesting thing that's happening internationally at the moment is the trialling of green hydrogen and hydrogen derivative products like ammonia in power generation. So there is a potential pathway there for decarbonisation of thermal peaking capacity as well, especially for our gas peaking.
We're getting a lot of questions coming through, which is excellent. Everybody's very, very interested in you guys, which is great. So we'll turn to a few of these questions, right? So I guess the first one that I've had is about the proposed pumped hydro project at like Onslow. Do you see it as a threat to the entrepreneurial type private sector in terms of or is it complementary to your work?
Want me to go first? I'll answer that.
You go first. Yeah.
Look, I think the pumped storage idea is worth having on the table, and it plays a role, I think, in establishing kind of what one of the bookends of the suite of solutions are. I think it probably in the fullness of time will be seen to be cost prohibitive, and because it appears to have that sort of possibility, it will drive other solutions. There's a handful of things that could occur prior to that decision that would be hugely beneficial to the market. And I think it's a good stalking horse. It causes people to think about, we need to really think about dry year risk in a new way when we talk about having 100% renewable energy. But it really is a case of, now that we know that that's out there, what are all of the other things that we can do to either perpetually defer that idea or just simply replace it with better ideas? And I'm not one of those people that believes we should be worried about the last 2 or 3% or the last 5%. We should be worried about what's the first 5%, what's the first 10%, do the things that are in front of us now first and get them going, and then we'll use our innovation later to clean it up when it gets a little bit more difficult. And I think the pumped storage will ultimately be seen to be displaced with other creative ideas.
Nigel, how about you? What's your thoughts on pumped storage?
We think there'll be a shandy of things that would lead to a better outcome than this one silver bullet of an Onslow. There is pumped hydro opportunities in the North Island, which are much closer to your major demand centres. Onslow is about the worst place you could look to build a pumped hydro as far as supply and demand in New Zealand and coming across interconnectors. But the likes of biofuels, we're looking to bring biofuels into the Huntley Power Station potentially. Flexible hydrogen that Cathy talked about earlier, where hydrogen can interplay, electricity could play that interrole between hydrogen generation and then dry year. But also major demand management and virtual batteries. People forget about the role that maybe increased role that TY could play in aluminium smelters turning down at various times, turning off pot lines, but also Methanex's role in the gas industry as well. So when you bring all those things together, there's multiple options to solve the dry year risk going forward. And to be honest, markets will solve it better than government.
Yeah. So you're sort of like load interruption, you're sort of meaning in terms of when you're talking at TY point. And what about load interruption at the consumer level? Would we ever consider having time whereby it's more expensive to use pricing at peak hours, more expensive to use power at peak hours? So try and shift consumer behaviour a little bit off and smooth the peaks. How about that type of? Would you see a role for that?
Yes, I would, and I think it's only a matter of time before that unfolds. As Gary said earlier, New Zealand's blessed in having such a large rollout of advanced smart meters in electricity, and then Genesis is rolling out advanced smart meters in gas now. We're the first to be rolling that out. As that technology takes hold, it gives you the ability to differentiate tariff pricing. When you start to get home batteries and EVs more penetrated in the market, I think these things are absolutely going to unfold. So consumer behaviour will be there, as well as large industrial.
Yeah, I think I
Cathy,
agree wholeheartedly with Gary around using contractual mechanisms and market mechanisms for helping to solve that dry year problem. That some of the sort of thinking that we've been doing around hydrogen and the development of hydrogen markets internationally is really, if you get to that stage of scaling, and it will require significant generation, it requires offshore markets to be developed, and that's still some time away as well. So it's probably within the same time frame as Onslow, though. Then you can imagine a scenario where you can be trading in hydrogen. You could be turning off your production during a dry year, having trade arrangements with between other countries. We have a dry winter, for example. Tasmania is looking at export. They have a dry summer, so there's quite a good sort of seasonality play. You could be keeping stores is one option, but that's probably the most expensive option. And you could also be importing hydrogen if it was required during one of those dry year scenarios. So you can see there's lots of different commercial pathways once that market develops. There's obviously a lot of steps to happen to get to that point as well, but it could be done incrementally. So you don't need to put all your eggs in one basket and make a huge investment up front. You can actually stage it over the next 10, 20 years.
It is a real portfolio approach.
Andrew, if I could just chip in one more quick thing.
Sure.
Every electric car that's being built today is likely to be having software in it that will allow the car to be charged when the electricity price drops below a certain price. And so in effect, you could have hundreds of thousands of cars charging when the sun is shining, and they turn off when the electricity system gets a bit constrained. And so, given the cars have ranges that last 7 days or so of daily normal use, that would be quite a normal way for this market to evolve. And like I said, New Zealand is leading the world with smart metering technology, and you can see how those price signals can be brought together at a consumer level to manage this issue as well. Yeah,
so there is a real portfolio approach across different fuels, different types of energy. The interesting questions that's just come through is related to procurement. So with so much growth happening and going to happen, how do we maintain a sustainable approach to procurement and construction, given New Zealand's such a small market? How do we develop that skill set and maintain it?
Well,
do you want to go first, Nigel? Oh, okay, you go first, Gary. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly. If you're talking about solar farms, which I think is a big issue right now, most of our technology is coming from China, and we have to deal with global supply chains to get this technology. So that's clearly an issue. I think the world's about to go through 5 years of sort of reorganizing itself to deal with the high demand for this technology. But on the ground, I think we touched on it earlier. Both Nigel and I said, we need to have the capability on New Zealand soil to build this stuff, and we're as at Lodestone, we're making it one of our main planks of our long-term success will be based on having people that know how to do it here, know how to engineer it, know how to put it together, and we think New Zealand has to have this as one of its key employment strategies, because you just see the wave of it coming, and it's just going to be impossible to continually import this capability to do it effectively.
Yeah.
So we think this is actually one of the great news stories. Any government should get in front of this parade and do whatever they can to help make it happen.
Totally, because I mean, the growth is global, and countries will need their own people. What about you, Cathy? What's your views on sort of the sustainability of procurement and developing talent?
Definitely, it has to be front and center of what we're doing, and the scale of what we need to do to decarbonise. And as Gary says, I guess the demand internationally as well for those skills and the technologies is just growing exponentially at the moment. So we do need to develop capability in country, and I think work together as an industry in order to do that. But also we are seeing that there's going to be a really strong need for manufacturing of equipment to support this transition as well, especially in our area. So that creates great opportunities as well. So there will be opportunities for new capability and manufacturing capability in country, and that can be more sustainable rather than, I guess, importing all our technology and goods and services to have it produced closer to home. But it's going to be a real challenge as well, because obviously when you're producing new products, you are creating some emissions there as well. So that is a key challenge, and something that we need to be all conscious of trying to manage, and keeping our supply chain emissions as low as possible in our construction emissions. So,
there is a knock-on effects, aren't there?
Yeah, it's not easy.
And Nigel, with Genesis's Future of Work program, this is something your company is very cognizant of, continuing to develop future talent?
Very much, yeah. Look, our Arta Pathways program is very much about how do we bring young people into the future of STEM work, and particularly young Māori in the communities in which we operate. So very much we see the growth of these technologies is going to create opportunities in a variety of roles that we can bring people into, but also into traditional hydro and others as well, that, to be honest, has an aging workforce. And so we think there's great opportunities. I think, per Gary said, we can source a lot of that within New Zealand. And to be honest, a lot of our young engineers and that are very excited about being able to branch into solar and other things and grow that depth. But I think the equipment in the short term is still likely to come from offshore, just competing with sheer cost of the likes of solar panels and wind turbines. That's likely to be foreign sourced, but certainly the installation and support of that should be a viable local industry.
And grow that, because there's going to be more and more of these being built of different scales, because they're all going to be utility scale. Some are going to be on buildings, warehouses. There'll probably be a lot more residential solar coming as prices continue to come down. Now, here's an interesting question. What about tidal energy? Do you want to start, Gary?
I mean, I think tidal energy. You see pilot projects around the world. Some of the great tidal waters in Eastern Canada and in Europe have been tested for this. It's a great idea. It's probably going to be in that category of always a bit of a fringe activity, in the sense that it takes quite a lot of equipment spanning quite a lot of ocean area to make quite a lot of power, and so it's not going to make a big difference, but it could have very niche application.
Yeah. And Nigel, any views?
I don't see it as happening. I think it's being gazumped by other technology. So every trial they've done in Australia is washed up on the shore after a big storm. I'm a bit biased in my view, but I've seen tens of millions of dollars have been wasted in Australia that's led to nothing. So I don't see a future for it at all, to be honest.
I'm probably more being on the entrepreneurial side, never discount technology.
Maybe they just need bigger anchors, maybe. But anyway, we'll see.
There's work going on in wave power as well, which may actually end up being more promising. But I think as we're seeing, internationally with the development of offshore wind, it's going to be quite hard to compete with offshore wind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One source of electricity we haven't touched on is geothermal. During the course of sort of my research for the session, I noticed that New Zealand, we're ranked about 6th in the world globally for geothermal. Nigel, what are your views on sort of future of geothermal? Is that, is there going to be a lot more geothermal, or are we going to be a lot more reliant on wind and solar for our renewables for future growth?
Look, I think there's going to be obviously some more geothermal, and as I said earlier, we've signed up PPA for quite a large amount from one of Contact's developments. But I think you'll probably see some more in New Zealand because of the natural advantage New Zealand has in that space. But having said that, I think it's going to compete with this shandy of other technologies and the advent of hydrogen and others. So and obviously it has to be worked through. There's obviously that context of is it purely renewable, and there's a lot of debate around the implications of geothermal, but it is baseload energy, and I think one can't discount that. Do you have that solid underpinning of your grid? Yeah,
and there is obviously, we are a small country, and there are less geothermal resources, and they're not quite as probably as plentiful as as wind and solar, which is like infinite, right? So there will always be some kind of restrictions there.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So we've got about 1 minute more. Maybe we're just, if you guys could just, don't think we've got enough time for any more questions, just generally because they're quite long questions and we'll run out of time very quickly. So maybe if we could just sort of sum up and just provide sort of an overall view, starting with you, Cathy, about the future.
Well, I think overall the future is very bright. We're really excited to see Lodestone's announcements and Genesis's announcements and the other announcements around renewables in the market. I think it's great, and we're going to need a lot more of this in the future. Sure. I think in terms of the immediate future, I think there are some challenges coming out of COVID. I think there is a lot of pressure on our supply chains. There's a lot of pressure on our construction workforce. There's a lot of money being funneled into recovery at the moment. So I do see like the next sort of few years as potentially being a challenging timeframe. And there is an ongoing role for the government to be playing in this space. So we were very fortunate that we secured effectively financing for our refueling network from the government, and they've played a really big role there, and also some funding into our other projects. But having sort of, I guess, clear policy and financial mechanisms that are going to help support, I guess, the newer development and developers and projects that are coming through, especially in our space where it isn't as developed as, say, solar and wind on its own. They're going to be really critical to how this industry develops over the next 5 years.
And Nigel, your views? Yeah. Very quickly, we're running right out of time.
Look, I think we should be optimistic. I think we're seeing action as we speak. But I think the one thing I'd say that we've got to remind ourselves is we're an islanded nation that has to come up with the solutions from within. We don't have thumping big interconnectors across the border bringing in electricity or gas, and we can't import LNG. So we are truly an islanded nation that needs to develop sustainable and economic solutions from within. And we don't want to forget that, because we're not like other countries, a lot of the other countries in the world that get held up as being bastions of renewable event, when they have a nuclear power station across the border supplying.
Providing their backup. And finally, Gary, if you could.
I'll be brief. I agree with everything that's said. One thing that's great about New Zealand is, we've always faced enormous challenges. When I developed the first gas plant in Southdown back in 1994, we said we would run out of gas one day and we wouldn't be able to power gas-fired power plants, and then we'd have to think of something else. And sure enough, those challenges are being met. And we are a native country. We have because we're an island, maybe it, as Nigel says, it's driving a certain behavior. But I am extremely optimistic that we will get to 100% renewable energy. I think hydrogen will be a big part. I think solar will be everywhere. I think offshore wind will be there, and we have the economy that can pay for all of that stuff through effective market mechanisms. So I'm extremely optimistic, and it'll be hard. It'll be difficult. Not everyone's at it, but we'll get there, and it feels like we're really well positioned.
Great, thank you, Cathy, Nigel, and Gary. Sorry. Apologies to the audience that Blair wasn't able to make it today. We had a slight technological problem, but thank you, panelists, for your time today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you
Been
very
great
much.
to join you.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Andrew, Cathy, Nigel, and Gary. Those were fabulous insights. Again, just quick apologies from and to Blair. I know he's been trying really, really hard to join us, but hey, that's the challenge of technology for a conference such as this. But he will, I just want to emphasize, he will actually be joining INZ in early December for a discussion on renewable energy, so a chance to hear from him then. So just to finally, a quick thank you to Westpac as our sponsor for this session. Great session. Again, thank you, Andrew. I hope you've all enjoyed the discussion. I'd invite you to take a really, really quick stretch. You've got till 9:50, which I think is about 3 minutes, to be back to listen to Andrew Bailey's opposition address. Thank you very much.
And darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand now. Stand by me. Stand by.